A personal injury case is so serious because the injury itself is physical. It's something that affects your whole being. And we all know that even a simple toothache can destabilize your whole day or your whole life. You need an attorney when you get involved in either in an accident or you got injured because you need someone who will be the one to advocate for you. You will be blindsided by the insurance company because all their bottom line is to save their company money, and you wouldn't even know what your case is worth. I have personally been involved in 3 auto accidents. In one of them, I thought I was going to die. So I know what it feels like to go through the trauma of injuries, accident, and pain. So we represent our client coming from that angle. We treat them as individuals, not just a number, not just a commodity. We walk with them through their journey of pain, recovery, justice, and restoration. If you've been injured in an accident and you need a good attorney to represent you, you need to call the Olawale law firm. We understand you. We'll walk with you through your pain and we'll get you the fair compensation that you need. Welcome to this episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel Olawale. My guest today is a class action attorney. You don't get to meet a lot of people like him. His name is Michael Boyle. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you so much for having me, Emmanuel. It's great to be on.
Thank you for coming. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Boyle. I've been an attorney now for a little over 13 years. I've been in practice here in Columbus now for about 11 and a half years. I came to Columbus in 2011 to work for a federal judge here in town, Judge R. Cole, who is a judge on the Federal Court of Appeals and who is the first African American Chief Justice of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. He actually just announced he was taking senior status about a few months ago, so getting a well-deserved break from being a judge. But I came there, and that position was only a year-long position, and so I sort of thought, well, I'll do this for a year and then go someplace else. And I just really fell in love with Columbus, with the community and all that, and decided to stay. And since 2013, since March of 2013, I've been a lawyer at Meyer Wilson here in Columbus and doing pretty much exclusively class action work. So we're one of the few firms in the city. I hesitate a little bit to say we're the only one, but we're the only one that I know of that has a full-time class action practice. You know, there's a lot of lawyers who do class actions every once in a while, but I think we're really the only ones that have lawyers who do just that. And myself and Matt Wilson are pretty much exclusively class action lawyers. So it's been a really exciting practice. You know, we do cases all over the country about a lot of different topics. I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we talk here, but that's kind of how I came to Columbus and how I came to do this work.
Oh, thank you. You were born in New York.
I was born in New York City. My parents met in New York City. My mom's from New Jersey, and my dad is from northeastern Pennsylvania. In fact, he shares that area of the country with both the president, Joe Biden, is from Scranton, PA, and if you've ever seen the TV show The Office, it's set in Scranton. So that's the area where my dad is from, and then they both ended up in New York and met each other, and I'm the first of 4 kids. So I was the first one born, and then after being born, we moved when I was very young to New Jersey, and then eventually, when I was sort of a young teenager, we moved to Florida, and so I basically spent junior high and high school in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where I was, and then my parents have since moved back to Philadelphia. I tell people they're probably the only people in America who, when they retired, they went from Florida to Philadelphia as opposed from Philadelphia down to Florida. But they always have to do things kind of the hard way. So
What was it like for you growing up in New Jersey?
well, I mean, I think it's sort of one of those things. Initially, it's sort of all right? It's kind of that's what your life is like. So we're probably about 90 minutes from New York City, but right on the ocean. So in Monmouth County, New Jersey, which is just sort of the first county on the shore. And so it's a lot of little small towns, some beach towns. My mom grew up actually in a beach town, a town called Monmouth Beach, New Jersey. So it feels very suburban in a lot of ways, a lot of little towns and that sort of thing. And I think the biggest thing that I didn't realize was unusual until going to someplace else and talking to other people is all of our kind of our news and all of our sort of information we got really revolved around New York City. And so we were very much in the greater New York City area. And so I just sort of assumed that was normal, is that everybody talked about New York and that New York was the greatest city in the world. And then you move to other places and they talk about New York as being very exotic. And it was just, for us, it was just kind of normal. I mean, I remember one of the traditions in our family was that my dad on New Year's Eve, he would always take the kids up with him to go to work. So we would get on the train and go all the way up to New York City and go into the building. And at one point, he worked in the now unfortunately gone World Trade Center towers. So I remember very clearly, getting on the train, getting off the train, looking up at those World Trade Center towers, and then going into, the office that he worked at. So, just being around New York City felt very sort of normal to me. But I didn't realize until we moved away how kind of unusual that was to be near such a big city.
Oh, thank you. And what was your home life like?
I mean, it was great. It was it was a big family. I mean, a big family. I think by modern standards, my parents are from very large families. My mom's one of 10 kids, and my dad's one of 6. So I guess for them, they didn't see it as very big, but it's pretty big by modern standards. And then I think there's a pretty large gap between the kids. So my youngest sister is 13 years younger than I am. So there was sort of always little kids around, even through like high school. And so, like we we're all very used to like changing diapers and all of that sort of thing. I mean, that was just kind of part of what you did when you were one of the older kids. But yeah, no, it was a great family to grow up in. I mean, we did move around a little bit at a couple points during childhood, and that's always tough. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, I think, for in any situation. But yeah, it was great, and it's a big, loud, kind of opinionated, sort of family that really still gets together. Now, my brother is still down in Jacksonville, down in Florida. But now both of my sisters are in Philadelphia. So it's kind of, I'm here in Columbus, Philadelphia, and then Jacksonville are kind of the 3 places where everybody is.
Thank you. And you went to high school in Florida?
Did Bishop Kenny High School in Jacksonville, Florida. Yeah. I mean, I think that was one of the things that was a real kind of change for us when we went down to Florida, because one of the things, Florida, I think when people think of Florida, they tend to think of Miami or maybe Orlando, depending on what they've done. But Jacksonville is very much the South, kind of culturally and sort of the way that it is part of the state. And one of the things that was really kind of a struggle for us when we first moved down there is, my parents put a big, emphasis on education. And I think in general, and certainly in Jacksonville, there isn't that kind of focus. And so one of the things that became pretty clear pretty quick was, my parents were concerned about kind of the education that we were getting in the public schools. And so kind of moved us into the Catholic schools to kind of get a little better, a little better education there. And so that's where I went to high school and that's where my brother went to high school as well. So at the time, it was the only Catholic high school in Jacksonville. There's now another one, but at the time, it was the Catholic high school, and it was that was a really, I think, great experience. I mean, I had a number of really excellent teachers there that really sort of set me in a good path to kind of, when I went on to college and everything like that. So I'm really very grateful for the education that I got at the particular place I went to high school.
Yeah, teach a child the way it should go. And
Mm-hmm.
when he grows up, he won't depart from it.
That's
And
right.
that actually came to fruition after you graduated from college. You wanted to become a Catholic priest.
I did, yes.
Tell us about that.
Sure. So, yeah, it was an interesting kind of thing. I mean, I kind of, being around in a Catholic school, I think, I mean, we were raised Catholic, but I think we weren't, we were not I wouldn't say it was a particularly like strict family or that was a, kind of overwhelming point of emphasis, but it was part of, what we were about as a family. And I just got really kind of interested in it and really sort of engaged with it. And I think particularly in high school, and I think what for me, I think some kids, they view the religion thing as something that their parents are kind of imposing on them. And so they sort of push back on it. For me, it was much more, this is something that I'm finding for myself, and that I'm deciding whether it's important for me or not. And so, in through high school, and then really as I was getting into college, as I was thinking about, what I wanted to do. And I went to college just outside of Chicago, which is obviously a big city with a tremendous kind of Catholic population. I met some people, met some priests and some things, and basically decided that was what I was going to try to do. So pretty much right after college, I went in and began my studies, and I basically it's a fairly lengthy program, of training, and I left pretty much sort of in the beginning-ish phases. So I would have had a way to go if I was going to stay. But yeah, I was there from basically 2001 to 2003. So about 2 years.
And what changed?
Well, I think it was, I think it was a couple things. I think that, sometimes you just get a feel. I think as someone who's, going from 22 to 24 and just out of college, I think for a lot of people, that's kind of the period where you really figure out who you are, where you're first kind of off on your own and out of that structure of kind of education, because you learn, at least I did, this idea that like, well, school puts sort of challenges in front of you and you just kind of show up and do the challenges that are there and you just keep going, and there's not a lot of sort of having to figure out what kind of person you are in that way. And so I think for me, that time, those 2 years with the Dominicans, which was the group that I was with, the Order of Preachers, or the Dominicans, was a time to really figure out who I was. And as part of that process, it just became clear that this is just not where I saw myself for my future. And so I really think it was a kind of just maturing, and I don't want to say maturing out of the idea of being a priest, because that makes it seem like it's kind of juvenile, and I don't mean that. But in my particular case, it was just a question of, hey, this is just not how I see myself, and as I see my life. And I think, as most people know, particularly in the Roman Catholic priesthood, you make a lot of sacrifices, including the sacrifice of not getting married, not having family, and all that kind of stuff. And I basically just decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I left on very good terms. I'm still friends with, some of the people that I knew from that, but it was pretty clear that, like, okay, it's time to go on and do something else.
Thank you. Did you agonize over that decision before pulling the trigger?
I agonize much more honestly about going in. I think there was definitely a moment that I can remember pretty clearly when the decision to leave sort of became pretty clear. And I think it's one of the experiences that I've had in a number of different contexts, but that was sort of one of the first ones where when something is right, you just kind of know. That there's that moment where you might be wrestling with something, and then there'll be that moment where you're like, okay, this is clearly the direction I want to go, and I'm just going to sort of do that. And I think one of the things I've learned is that can feel sort of sometimes a little arbitrary, like why all of a sudden does this seem very clear? And you can almost kind of talk yourself out of that. And so one of the things I've really learned is when you get that feeling, just go down that path, because that's usually, you've worked something out internally that you may not be able to like articulate like all of the steps, but you've come to a decision, even if you can't necessarily reproduce for somebody what that decision is, and just go with it. And so that was really the first of those experiences in my life. I've had others, and it was just it just became clear one day. I'm just like, what, this is just not where I need to be. And I think the other thing to say is that this is not untrue now, but it was particularly true at the time that I was there. I was there probably during the most chaotic kind of period of time to study to be a priest, because it was right when all the sex abuse stuff happened. And I think that, that I wouldn't be being truthful if I didn't say that also had something of an impact, not in the sense of like, not directly, but more in the sense of just things were just in a very kind of unsettled sort of state. And I really had this question of, am I prepared to commit my life to this in the current form? And I basically I came to the answer that, no, I'm just not, so, so that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that's basically kind of the story there.
Thank you. When did you realize that you wanted to become a lawyer?
So it's funny, when I left, I was looking for a job, and because I didn't have backup plans. I was just like, okay. So I actually went back home to Florida, to kind of regroup, frankly, and I got a job teaching in a school for court reporters, and they asked me in my job interview, can you teach a legal terminology class? And I basically sort of thought, yeah, I can teach that, sure, I'll figure it out, right? And I got the job, and I was teaching the class, and I just sort of like, wow, I actually really am interested in this. I really like this. And at the same time that was going on, my younger brother was in law school, because he had gone into law school basically right out of college. So he sort of was ahead of me in that process. And, talking to him and sort of his experience with that, I'm like, yeah, I can see myself doing this. And so, I had about 2 years there teaching, and 1 year sort of deciding I wanted to do this, and then another year to like applying to schools and stuff like that. And so I started law school in the fall of 2005.
Oh, that's awesome. What was the transition like for your parents to accept the fact that you are no longer going to become a priest?
Well,
Because I know that. Okay.
So sure, go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Finish
Yeah,
the
because
question.
there's a pride that comes from Catholic parents,
Sure.
knowing that one of your son is going to become a priest.
Well, it's interesting. I think that the reaction of my two parents was actually very different. I think my mother was who normally when you hear these stories, it's the mom who is usually the one who's particularly excited. I think my mother was very, very hesitant and sort of skeptical about this, and I think that for her it was, I don't want to say relief, but I think she basically knew or sort of saw that this probably wasn't going to work out and was not really. So I don't want to say it wasn't that she wasn't supportive, but it was more like I think she sort of saw what was coming and how this was going to go. So it was not a particular surprise to her. I think my dad, one of the great things about my dad is that he is genuinely a person who is really supportive of whatever it is that you want to do. And so I think he was sort of surprised, and he had sort of questions about like, okay, what are you going to do next? That sort of thing. But, honestly, my parents were very, very supportive of me leaving. It really wasn't an issue in the way that, some of the stories. And I think also part of that too was, because my parents were not, this was never something that they pushed on me. And so therefore, when I said I didn't want to do it, it wasn't that I was, disappointing some dream that they had. So that actually really wasn't, much of an issue really for them.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they're very proud of you now. So tell us, what is class action?
Okay, so class actions are a kind of lawsuit, both in federal court and in state courts here, like state court in Ohio, where a group of people who have had the same injury get brought together to have that injury resolved in one case. So you can have a class action that brings together. I've been involved in cases that in the end had millions of plaintiffs that get kind of consolidated together into a single case. And that's really, I think, the important thing about it, and something that I think people who, most people have heard of class actions in a kind of general way, but I think the thing that confuses people is they hear about lawsuits that involve lots of similar lawsuits being brought together. Like, so for example, you'll see advertisements on television for lawsuits involving, hey, if you've taken this drug, or if you have had this medical device. Those are not class actions. Those are big groups of individual cases that are usually kind of brought in the same court, but they're all individual lawsuits. Class action is one lawsuit that involves a whole bunch of people. And so there's a series of very special rules about how those cases get brought, how they get kind of resolved, and all that kind of thing. So,
Okay. How do you decide the kind of cases to file as a class action?
Well, the main criteria for the case to be successful, right? I mean, obviously you can file bad class action cases that don't work, but for the case to be successful, the key piece of it is that the injury that everybody in the group that you want to represent has received is as close as possible to being exactly the same. So I'll just give a single example of cases. We have a number of cases that we're working on at my firm that involve data breaches, right? Where a company has let information, get stolen by hackers. And usually what happens is there's a single event where a hacker has gotten into a computer system of a particular company and downloaded a bunch of information for, maybe it's all of the employees or everybody who has been a patient at a hospital, and does it like all at the same time. So everybody whose information was taken has had exactly the same injury because it happened at the same time. It was done by the same people. All of those factors are exactly the same. And that really is the heart of it, of how you get a successful class action. Because what the goal of class actions is to make it so that in one proceeding, you can resolve all of those claims all at the same time. And so the more different the circumstances and facts are for each person, the less it's able to work as a class action.
So how do you generate information of the people that will have to be added to the class?
Well, I mean, we do it a number of different ways. At our firm, I mean, sometimes we will get just cold calls. Just like at your firm, people call you and they say, "Hey, I've had this problem." And because we do class actions, we're sort of thinking about whether those cases can work as class actions. We also work with, we have a fairly significant array of other lawyers and law firms who will refer cases to us. So, a lawyer will talk to somebody and they'll go, "Hey, I think that might be a class case, but I don't really do class cases, but these guys do." And so we'll get them there. So a lot of our casework is through referrals. And another thing too is, my law firm is very small. I mean, we're only 6 lawyers and only 3 of us do class actions full time. So a lot of our cases involve co-counsel relationships where we'll work with other lawyers and other law firms. And so, sometimes we'll, the client will be with the other, the other law firm, and they'll go, "Hey, do you want to work on this class case?" And one other thing, just to sort of point out about the way classes work, and this is another thing I think people sort of don't understand, is in order to have a class, you only need one person who is going to be the representative to stand in for the whole group. So, a lot of people will say, "I heard about this class case. Do I need to sign up to be part of it?" No, you don't. You only, as long as there's a representative who will say, I'll represent everybody in this group, then the case can go forward. So you don't need to find everybody who has been affected by a particular thing. You really just only need to find one person. And that one person has to be sort of similar to everybody else in the group. But so it's, we class action lawyers generally don't do the kind of, advertising, getting back to the like drug and medical device cases. They generally don't need to do that kind of mass advertising where, you buy television ads and things like that. I mean, you could, but given that you only really need one person in the group, it's just not as necessary for our practice as it is for the folks who do those kind of cases, which are generally called mass torts, the medical, the device cases or the drug cases and stuff. And that's really where the advertising is. For class cases, you don't need it as much.
Thank you. Can the main plaintiff, how do you determine how much they get after the case is settled? Do they get more than other class members?
Yeah.
Or
so
is it the same?
Well, right. So the baseline kind of recovery that they would get is going to be the same recovery that they would get, that anybody else in the class would get. Now, depending on the nature of the case, different people might get different recoveries depending, because they might have different kinds of damages. But the base for the class is, if you're a representative, you're going to get whatever everybody else would get if you weren't a representative. However, because the representative is sort of doing the work on behalf of the class, there's a procedure that at the end of the case, whether the case settles or it goes to trial and you get a trial victory, it's pretty common to ask the court to award what's called an incentive award to the representative. And it's usually, depending on how much work that the representative has done, it's usually in the neighborhood of somewhere between $1,000 and a few tens of thousands of dollars. It tends not to be. I've never seen one, and in none of the cases I've involved in has anybody ever gotten $100,000 or anything like that, or even 50 that I recall. I think the biggest I've ever seen is 25,000 in any of our cases. And so, we always tell the clients that are signing up to be class representatives, being a class representative is not a way to get rich. You're signing up to do this because you want to be the way in which not only yourself, but everybody else can get made whole for whatever it is that, happens to them. So it's a nice thing. I think it's appropriate. It's up to the discretion of the court, though. The court can say no. Or the court can reduce the amount that we ask for. We can ask for 10, and the court can say, no, you're only going to get 5. I mean, that's all within the court's discretion. But we always ask for it. And my experience is that generally courts will grant them, because they recognize that, there is more work involved, and that they do, are it helps allow classes to go forward, to give them a little something.
Thank you. After the case is settled and the main plaintiff gets paid and attorneys get paid, how do you distribute the rest of the funds to members of the class?
Well, it really depends, and it depends on the nature of the case. So if the case settles, then that distribution will be agreed upon by the parties with the defendant. I mean, if the case goes to trial and you win, then just like any other sort of trial, the court will award damages to each person in the in the class, based on what the nature of the injury is, and what statute, and all of the standard ways in which that works in any kind of civil trial. But in settlements, that's something that's negotiated, and it really depends on the circumstances. A lot of settlements will be, the defendant will create a fund. It'll be X amount of dollars, and you pay the expenses, and you pay the lawyers out of that, and then oftentimes you just divide it equally among all the class members. That's a very common way to do it. Sometimes there will be structures where people have to make claims. So, I'm thinking, for example, again, in data breach cases, people will, hey, my identity was stolen, and here's what it costs me to, I lost $5,000, because it was taken on my bank account, or, whatever. And you would submit that as a claim, and they would get paid $5,000. And if somebody else lost $2,000, they would get paid $2,000, but it really depends on the nature of the case, and whatever you can negotiate with the defendants if you're settling it. But one of the things that we really try to do is two things. One is to try to make it as equitable, obviously, as possible for everybody in the class. And then the other thing is to really give people meaningful relief. I mean, there's a lot of stories out there of people getting checks for $2 and things like that. And, we do everything possible to try to avoid that, because it doesn't feel like people are actually getting anything of real value. And our view is it kind of makes people skeptical of class actions and class action settlements in general. So, we really try to avoid, those kind of $2 settlements. I mean, there's also now rules in place. For a while, there were a lot of these coupon settlements where, you bought some product, and it would be like, hey, here's a coupon to get, $30 more of the same product, or something like that. And people are like, wait a minute, but this, you just had this lawsuit about how this product was bad, and now you're giving me a coupon to buy more stuff. So the courts, at least in federal court, they've actually really cracked down on those coupon settlements. And so they're really very much disfavored now, and we tend to not do those really kind of at all.
Thank you. Yeah, there are those who are against any form of litigation, that believes that class action lawsuits are just for the attorneys to make a killing.
Right.
What do you have to say to people like that?
Well, I think that what I would say to that is, with basically every class action that I've been involved in, if we hadn't have filed the case, then basically nobody in the class would have gotten any recovery of any kind. And, and I think that's another one of those misconceptions about class cases is, these tend to be cases where the amount of money that is involved for a particular person is small, such that they're not going to bring their own lawsuit. It doesn't make sense. If you've lost $40 or if you've lost $100, it really doesn't make sense to go sue a big company to get your $100 back. And companies know that, and so they know nobody's going to do that. So a class is a way for people to get their money back, without having to, bring their own lawsuit, which everybody knows they're not going to do. And for the people who want to bring their own case, every class has a procedure in which you can opt yourself out of the class and bring your own lawsuit. So nobody's ever going to be prevented from doing their own thing by any class case. I mean, it's written right into the rules, except for some very narrow circumstances involving a fixed amount of money where like the defendant is bankrupt and stuff like that. Other than some very, like unusual circumstances, if you want to bring your own lawsuit and you think you can do better than the class action people, you can always do that. But the truth of the matter is almost nobody is going to, and everybody understands that. And so it is a way to, to do that. The other thing I would say is, you do personal injury law. I know in your practice, and you have an agreement with your client to recover a portion of, what is recovered. That's standard in personal injury cases. And that percentage is something that you just negotiate with the client. Now, there's ethical restrictions about how high you can go and all that kind of stuff. But in general, my fees in a class case are subject to the supervision of the court. So the court comes in and says, yeah, this is a sufficient percentage. And I mean, we've had a number of cases where we brought them to settlement and the court has chopped our fees down. And then, that's it for us. So in a lot of ways, there are a lot more restrictions on the fees that are paid to class action lawyers than are paid to lawyers in individual cases. So I think the problem, the way that this, I think people get that perception, because that's absolutely the perception. There's no question about that it's just sort of lawyer driven. But I think that what happens is, you see a case in which, let's say there's 1 million people in the class and everybody gets $30, so that's $30 million in total, but everybody's getting 30, and then they see the lawyers getting a percentage of the $30 million and they go, wait a minute, you're getting $6 or $8 or $9 million. I'm only getting $30. And it's like, well, yes, but we didn't just do this for you. We did this for 1 million people. And if you add up, a way to think about it is I'm getting $6 from you, and I'm also getting $6 from all of the other 1 million people who are in the exact same position you are. So there's a sort of sticker shock kind of problem when you see how much money is involved. But if you sort of break it down that way, it makes a lot more sense. I mean, the other thing I will say is class actions take a very long time. And so, and this is an unusual example. This is particularly long, but we just, and the settlement terms are not public yet, but I can say we just settled a case recently within the last, month or so ago. That has been that was filed at the end of 2012. And now again, that's a particularly long period of time, and the case was stayed for a number of years. So there's a number of things going on there, but we litigated that whole case, and we received zero money for that case for 10 years. And so, if you then present the fee amount, you're like, well, gosh, that feels like a large number. It's like, yeah, but we've eaten all the costs of that case for 10 years, and now it's the time to get paid on that. So, I understand that perception, but if you really kind of break it down, it really isn't as outrageous as people as it might seem.
Yeah, because you pool the risk together. You
That's
take
right.
the risk. You spend all the money. You spend the time working for free for people who might otherwise have not gotten paid, because it wouldn't be worth their while to file the lawsuit in the first place.
Sure, and as is the case with like personal injury cases and other kind of plaintiff's law. I mean, if we lose, we get nothing.
You get nothing.
And we've had cases. I mean, there was a class case that we litigated for an entire year. Pretty much, I mean, it was most of what I did for a year, and we lost, and so we got nothing from that. And that was that was not a good day, right? Like I'm not gonna, but that's sort of the reality of the risk that we take on. And so I think that that kind of risk is sort of built into the way that we, get compensated.
Yeah. Let's say someone, or let's say a group of people opt out to be in the
Mhm.
class. Can they file a parallel action and also a parallel class action to one that is pending? Can there
No,
be two
well,
classes?
not necessarily a parallel class. So once a class is actually certified, which is the rule that says, yes, this is a legal class, this meets all the requirements under Rule 23 and all that kind of stuff. Once you do that, somebody else can't file another class case, and if they were to try, we could go into their court and say, Judge, you can't certify this class. There's already a class there. Now, people can file independent individual cases, and that's completely fine. And it is also the case that oftentimes you will see multiple cases that haven't gotten to certification yet. So like there'll be one class case over here and there'll be another one over there. And that can get into a very interesting sort of situation. I mean, oftentimes you will see, depending on the relationship between the firms and the representatives, sometimes there'll be a deal to work together, and so they'll just consolidate that into one case. But sometimes you get into fights over which case should be the one that actually kind of goes forward, and some of it comes down to going to the court and saying, we're more experienced, lawyers, we've done more class cases, you should trust us to litigate it, because ultimately the class action lawyers are acting on behalf of the whole class, and the court has to make a decision of which group of lawyers are going to be in the best interest of all the people in the class. So I mean, it can get a little ugly, to be honest. And I think, but at the same time, I think one of the things that we at our firm, I think, have done a really good job in is, the class action world is relatively small. I mean, it's certainly small here in Columbus, but even across the country, it's a fairly small world. And so building relationships with other lawyers is really a key part of what we do. And I think that when you develop a reputation for being reasonable to work with, good lawyers, who get good results for their clients, it's easier to work out sort of deals, on cases, so that everybody can work together. And these cases are usually big enough that having multiple law firms working on a case is usually a good idea on its own. I mean, as I mentioned, we very often will partner with other law firms, to get more, access to more resources. And I mean, frankly, also to kind of spread the risk among a bunch of law firms, so that if we do a lot of work and the case and doesn't pay, it's not just us eating that, eating
Loss.
that time that's now not, being compensated for. So, but yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting kind of world where you get into some of those disputes, and I think it really comes down to personal relationships that you have, and building those relationships.
Okay. So how do you decide where to file the lawsuit, whether federal or state court?
Yeah. So back in, I want to say it was 2006, Congress passed a law called the Class Action Fairness Act, which made it so that a lot of cases that had previously been in state court as class cases now could be filed, or more accurately, defendants could move them to federal court. So, if the case is of a certain size, and if it involves people from multiple states, usually that case is one way or the other going to end up in federal court. I mean, the cutoff is $5 million, which is a lot of money, obviously, but in class terms is not that big. So I would say probably, I mean, my practice, I would say 85% of my practice is in federal court. Now, in terms of where across the country you file, I mean, that really depends on, where our client is, where the defendant is, sort of some of those kind of things. And I mean, also to be honest, certain federal jurisdictions are more favorable to class cases than others. So, we're also thinking about some of those strategic elements. But from generally speaking, for our practice, unless the case is exclusively people from one state, like it only involves Ohio people, which is often the case with a lot of those data breaches. If it's like a pretty small entity and all of their clients are in one state, then those might end up in state court. But otherwise, we're usually in federal court.
Okay, thank you. Then how do you determine whether or not to settle a case?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think is, it's based on a lot of factors. Some of it depends on the nature of the case and who is defending in a case. There are defendants who will fight, no matter what. There are other defendants where that's not the case. And so, obviously we can't just settle it unless the defendant is willing to, engage in settlement negotiations, right? So that's a big factor. My experience is that with, I guess, sort of one major exception in my career, if the class gets certified, usually defendants at that point are willing to try to settle the case, because at that point they know that they're going to be dealing with this big group of people. And so it makes sense for them to get kind of cost certainty for their perspective around it. And also, it also allows us to avoid trial risk. I mean, as you know very well, anytime you go to trial and you have a jury, it's an unpredictable situation. And so, from our perspective, if we can, get that certainty. I mean, the other thing that really factors into it from our perspective is a timing thing. Because class cases are so slow, if we were to say, okay, we're not going to settle this case, we're going to go all the way down the line through trial, through appeals, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, you can easily be looking at 5, 6, 7 years down the road versus, getting people their money now. And there's economics, talks about the time value of money, right? Like getting your money now versus the chance of getting potentially more, but maybe not in 7 years, that really is a factor. So, those are the kind of things we look at. And also, just like any other, case, we also evaluate the strength of our case and really look at it and say, and I think for some of the more complicated cases, that can really be a kind of moving target. We can, there are cases where at one point we think, this is really, really strong and we're really in a good position, and it can kind of fall apart a little bit. And that can change the way we think about it. And that happens. I mean, that's just, and that's true of any kind of plaintiff's practice. But it's in some respects in ours, it's just because our cases are sort of bigger. It's all of those considerations just kind of blown up. So yeah, I think that's, I mean, we've also had situations where settlement is driven by, because our cases can be very large, driven by the financial condition of the defendant. I mean, we have a case that's currently in the settlement process in federal court here in Columbus in front of Judge Marbley, who I'm sure many of your listeners know, the chief judge of the Southern District of Ohio. And that was an employment case. And one of the issues that involved in settling that case is the defendant, which is a hospital system out in the eastern part of the state, ran into some very serious financial problems relating to a hack, actually, of their systems. And they I mean, we had some very real concerns that if we had gone to trial and gone to the end of this, there wouldn't actually be any money for our clients because the hospital wouldn't exist anymore, and that we would be, fighting in bankruptcy court, or, a lot of those kinds of considerations. And we made the decision in consultation with our clients that, let's try to get money now while there's still an entity that exists. And, so that's another consideration that we sometimes have to take into account is, can the defendant pay what this judgment is that is out there? Because, I mean, there have definitely been class cases where they've gone to trial, got the result, and the defendant basically says, well, this is more than we can pay. We're shutting down our business, and, you can fight it out in bankruptcy court. I mean, fortunately, we haven't had that happen in our practice, but those war stories sort of circulate around the class action world, and that's one of the things I think, because you're always asking yourself what's in the best interest of the clients, and having to spend 6 years fighting it out in bankruptcy court is really not in the best interest of the clients. So those are some of the things that we look at.
Thank you. And you are in the process of another transition, if possible. You are running for office?
Well, I did. I ran for judge for the Court of Common Pleas here in Franklin County for the seat would begin in 2023. So I ran in the primary and came real close, but lost. I ran against Judge Julie Lynch, who is an incumbent judge, and so it was a very close race. It was basically 52-48. And so, it was, I'm still sort of like a little bit recovering from that, but yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there may be future opportunities along those lines. And definitely that's something I work at. I had never done anything like that before. I'd never ran a campaign. I mean, the joke I said was the last campaign I ran was for 8th grade class president. Yeah, it was a wonderful experience in the spring. I got to meet a tremendous number of people here in Columbus and in Franklin County that I probably wouldn't have met in other contexts. And yeah, it was really a great experience. So, disappointing outcome ultimately at the end of the day. But I definitely think that's something that I'm going to be, thinking about doing, in the future here. So.
Why would you want to leave your class action practice for the bench?
Well, I should say I love what I do still, and I love the firm that I work for, and it was nothing, relating to that. But, I think for a lot of people that I've talked to, the lockdown in 2020 was an opportunity, and certainly was for me, to really sort of take a moment to kind of, sort of assess who you are and where you're going in your life and kind of what you want. And I really felt like, I was sort of like, are there other challenges out there that I want to explore that I haven't really, looked at? I think the other thing too is, I kind of crossed the 10 years in this community threshold. And I love Columbus and I love Franklin County so much. And I really felt, I really would like an opportunity to give back and to really kind of have an opportunity for public service. And so, this idea kind of cropped up, and I sort of talked to some people, sort of expecting them in a lot of ways to say, who are you? Why are you here? And I didn't get that at all. I got a lot of positive feedback, and I just basically was like, all right, I'm going to give this a shot and see where this takes us. And, that's where it took us. It's where it took me. So, it was less about me wanting to leave my practice and more about, just like what else in there, what were the other opportunities in my life that I'm looking to, kind of explore. So.
Thank you. And what was the transition like for you having to go back to regular life after the campaign?
Well, it was, it was mostly, it was just kind of a little bit of exhaustion, because not only, so there was the campaign, and then the idea was going to be right after the primary, no matter what, we were expecting to go to trial in the case that I mentioned that just settled. So really, I went right into sort of trial prep mode after the primary, and it wasn't really until after that case settled that it settled over Memorial Day weekend, as it turned out. I was at dinner and I got the message that the case had settled, and that was really the moment where like it almost felt like kind of losing that runner's high a little bit, where you just been going and going and going, and you're not really sort of like thinking. You're just thinking about, okay, what do I have to do next? And then all of a sudden it's like you take that deep breath and you sort of say, oh, wow, okay. And so really the last sort of 6 weeks have been a little bit of just sort of recovering in a lot of ways, and just sort of I've really enjoyed the summer so far. A lot of just kind of doing that kind of stuff. I've had the chance to help out with some of the other judicial candidates that I got to know during the time, and that's been great. But I've really enjoyed having a much more, sort of a much more relaxed summer than I was, on my way towards, 3 or 4 months ago.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you for almost an hour now, and I'm sure our audience will, love all the information you've provided, because it's been very enlightening. So, what does it mean for you or to you to appear on Legal Angle and educate the public?
Well, first of all, I just really want to thank you, Emmanuel, for this opportunity to be on there. I've really enjoyed, talking to you here. And I think for me, it's just really a chance to give people an insight into an area of law that they probably have heard about, but really don't have a lot of sort of, direct experience in. And anytime, this is an area that I've dedicated a big portion of my life to. So I'm always eager to talk to people about what I do. And having a chance to do that is really always exciting. So thanks again for giving me this opportunity to chat with you today, and can't wait to give me a call if you want me to come back on. I'd love to do it.
We'd love to have you back. Yeah, thank you again for coming onto the show. And for those of you who are either watching us at home or listening to this as a podcast, thank you for listening. And until next time, take care and stay blessed. Bye for now.